A genome can speak languages the tongue never learned. Consider a puzzle that geneticists have been quietly debating for years. There is a population of nearly 40 million people living in the heart of Central Asia. They speak a Turkic language. They bear a name rooted in a medieval Khan who died in the 14th century. Their country is named after him. Their identity is framed around his legacy. And yet, when researchers extract DNA from the ancient bones buried beneath their cities, bones that are 3,000 years old, not 700, something unexpected appears. The deeper ancestry of the people living there today does not begin with a Turkic conqueror. It does not begin with Mongol horsemen or Persian administrators. It begins somewhere much older, much quieter, and much harder to name. So who exactly are these people? Genetically speaking, that question does not yet have a clean answer. And the further science digs, the more unsettled that answer becomes. Here is the story that historians have told for generations. And it is not a wrong story, it is simply incomplete. The Uzbeks as a people trace their formal emergence to the confederation that gathered around Uzbek Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde, who died in 1341. His followers, nomadic Turkic-speaking tribes who had moved across the steppes of what is now Kazakhstan, eventually pushed south into the lush agricultural heartland of Transoxiana, the ancient region between the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers. The Persians had called this land Sogdiana. The Greeks had marched through it. The Arabs had conquered it in the 7th century. The Mongols had shattered it in the 13th. By the 15th century, when the descendants of Uzbek Khan's people finally settled into its cities and oasis towns, they found a sedentary, Iranian-speaking population, the inheritors of an ancient Sogdian civilization, already there. The conquerors brought their language. The conquered kept their fields, their bread ovens, their irrigation channels. Historians recognize at least 3 layers in this story. The first layer, the ancient Iranian agricultural substrate, the Sogdian farmers and merchants who had worked this land for millennia. The second layer, the Turkic nomadic overlay, arriving from the northern steppes and eventually lending the population its modern language and name. The third layer, the Mongol administrative legacy, the ghost of Genghis Khan's empire reorganized through the Chagatai Khanate, which carved this region into administrative units before the Uzbek identity fully solidified. That is the textbook model. Turkicized descendants of Sogdian farmers, shaped by conquest from above. A young ethnic identity layered onto an old genetic foundation. That is the story. But the DNA tells a slightly different timeline, and a far more complicated one. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2010, a study titled The mtDNA Composition of Uzbekistan, a Microcosm of Central Asian Patterns, published in Forensic Science International, Genetics, by Irwin and colleagues, sampled individuals of Uzbek ancestry from 5 distinct geographic regions of the country: Fergana, Karakalpakstan, Khorazm, Kashgadarya, and Tashkent. Mitochondrial DNA, think of it as the maternal inheritance passed mother to child, generation after generation, almost without alteration, a kind of cellular memory of maternal lineage, was extracted and analyzed across these regional populations. What they found was not a single coherent genetic signature, it was a spectrum, a broad east-west cline stretching across Eurasian history. On one side of that spectrum, haplogroups associated with Western Eurasia, HUJT. These are the markers of ancient farming populations and steppe peoples from Europe and the Near East. On the other side, haplogroups associated with Eastern Eurasia, CDM, the genetic signatures of populations connected to East Asia and Inner Eurasia. A haplogroup, to be clear, is like a surname carried not in a family name, but in the cells themselves, a lineage marker passed invisibly through generations. And the Uzbek population carried both sides of this signature simultaneously, in proportions that varied dramatically by region. Here is the problem. That kind of deep, regionally differentiated diversity does not arise in 700 years. It does not arise from a single nomadic group absorbing a single farming population. It points to something far older. Then came 2021, a study published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, one of the most respected genetics journals in the world, published by Oxford Academic, by Kumar and colleagues, extracted DNA from 27 ancient individuals from archaeological sites in southern Uzbekistan. 27 individuals spanning the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. They analyzed approximately 1.2 million SNP targets per individual, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are like individual letters in the genome's alphabet, each one a tiny data point that, in aggregate, allows researchers to reconstruct ancestry with extraordinary precision. And the resolution that kind of data provides is fine enough to detect ancestry shifts of less than 10%, meaning if a major Mongol or Turkic population replacement had occurred, the data would have shown it. A break in the record, a discontinuity, a before and after. There was no break. Clean, expected, then suddenly not. The Bronze Age people of Uzbekistan carried a mixed ancestry of Iranian plateau-type lineages and steppe-related lineages. The Iron Age people carried that same mixture, with a modest increase in steppe-related ancestry, but the underlying core persisted. The people were not replaced, not by years, not by centuries, not by the Mongols. The first theory, the one most historians and many geneticists still favor, is called the elite dominance model, and it is genuinely compelling. Under this framework, Turkic nomads, and before them Mongol administrators, were numerically small compared to the populations they conquered. A few thousand mounted warriors do not replace millions of farmers. What they replace instead is the name, the language, the political category. The Sogdian farmers of Transoxiana did not disappear when Uzbek Khan's followers arrived. They adapted. They learned a new language. They adopted a new identity. Their DNA stayed almost exactly where it had been for 3,000 years. Supporting this interpretation is a striking historical footnote. In 1929, when the Soviet Union drew the borders of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, it formally separated Uzbeks from Tajiks, two populations that had been genetically and culturally intertwined for centuries, living in the same oasis cities, intermarrying, speaking both languages. Research citing data from the Library of Congress Federal Research Division suggests that up to 40% of the population administratively classified as Uzbek may have had ancestry more closely aligned with Iranian-speaking Tajiks. The border was political. The genome did not notice. This model explains the genetic diversity well. The Uzbek category is, by this reading, a relatively recent political construct laid over a much older, much more complicated gene pool. The people were there first. The label arrived later. But this model has a limitation, and it is a significant one. It doesn't explain why the Bronze Age populations of Uzbekistan, people who lived 1,500 years before the Mongols, 2,000 years before Uzbek Khan, already carried that same mixed ancestry. Something older was already happening here, something the medieval conquest story cannot account for. This is the part the records don't explain. The second theory is more complicated, and it pushes the origin story back by another 2,000 years. According to this interpretation, the genetic core of modern Uzbeks is not medieval at all. It is Bronze Age. Specifically, it reflects the legacy of two ancient cultures that overlapped in this precise region roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. The Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, known as bmac, and the andronovo culture of the western steppe. Think of bmac as the settled anchor, a sophisticated urban civilization of mud brick cities and irrigated agriculture, centered in what is now southern Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and northern Afghanistan. Think of andronovo as the moving force, steppe pastoralists pushing south and east from the Ural region, carrying the Y chromosome marker R1A1 with them. R1A1, to use a rough metaphor, is like a specific chapter in the paternal inheritance book, one that shows up in Bronze Age steppe warriors, and also, intriguingly, in modern populations from Eastern Europe to South Asia. In ancient Uzbekistan, it shows up as early as 1200 BCE. The Kumar et al. 2021 study found exactly this mixture in their Bronze Age individuals. Iranian plateau-type ancestry combined with andronovo-related steppe ancestry, and found it largely intact in the Iron Age individuals who came after. Under this theory, what the Turkic migration added was primarily linguistic, not a new people, a new name for an old one. The genetic structure of modern Uzbeks, this theory argues, was already essentially complete before the first millennium BCE ended. The limitation of this theory is almost elegant in its circularity. If you trace the andronovo people back far enough, they too were migrants. They came from the western steppe. The indigenous Bronze Age population of Uzbekistan was already a mixture. There may be no original unmixed source, only layers, all the way down. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, is perhaps the most unsettling. It suggests that the Uzbek case is not simply an example of elite dominance or Bronze Age admixture. It may be one of the most extreme examples in recorded history of ethnic identity becoming completely decoupled from genetic ancestry. A population that was genetically ancient Sogdian steppe was culturally redefined not once, not twice, but 3 times in under 800 years. First Mongol, then Turkic, then Soviet. 3 complete resets of the official identity. The genome, through all of it, barely moved. The more speculative edge of this theory goes further. Some researchers have proposed that the Silk Road itself, operating for roughly 1,500 years across this exact terrain, functioned as a slow, sustained genetic blender. Not through conquest, but through commerce. Through the merchants who stayed, the travelers who married, the caravanners who settled. Under this reading, the DNA of modern Uzbeks may contain what some have called ghost signals, genetic traces of populations that no longer exist as named groups. The Sogdians, the Saka, the Kushans, the Hephthalites, peoples whose civilizations collapsed or were absorbed, but whose chromosomes were quietly passed forward. Most geneticists are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. The data doesn't confirm it. It only fails to rule it out. What the regional data does confirm is variation. Karakalpakstan, in the northwest of Uzbekistan, shows notably higher East Eurasian haplogroup frequencies than either Fergana or Tashkent. That regional divergence is real. It suggests that whatever forces shaped the Uzbek genome did not do so uniformly. The blending, if it happened differently in different places, in different centuries, along different trade routes. The DNA may be encoding a history that left no written record, and we may not have the tools yet to read all of it. Imagine that it is early autumn in the Fergana Valley, and the temperature just before dawn is close to freezing. You are standing near the ruins of Aksiket, an ancient city that operated on this site continuously from the Iron Age through the medieval period, before it was finally abandoned. The Sir Daria moves somewhere to your north in the darkness, carrying snowmelt from the Tian Shan Mountains. Somewhere nearby, someone is already baking bread in a clay oven. Naan, the round flatbread that has been made in this valley for longer than anyone can reliably date. The smell of it reaches you across the cold air. Now imagine you have been handed a DNA result, your DNA result, and it tells you that your deepest maternal ancestry connects to a woman who lived in this valley 3,500 years ago, before the Uzbek language existed, before Islam arrived in the 7th century, before Tamerlane drew a sword, before Alexander the Great crossed the Oxus, before any of the names by which this region has been known were spoken by anyone. The face you see in the mirror is a modern face. The language you speak arrived roughly 1,000 years ago. The religion you practice came 14 centuries ago. The name of your country is 700 years old. But the cells running quietly in your body are carrying instructions written 35 centuries ago by people who had no word for Uzbek, who did not know they were Central Asian, who knew only this valley, this river, this bread, this cold. One elder in a Fergana community asked recently what she thought her ancestors were, gave an answer that had nothing to do with Mongols or Persians or Turkic Khans. She said, "They were the ones who stayed." She did not know she was describing what the science is now beginning to confirm. Here is the twist that reframes everything that came before it. The feature of Uzbek genetics that appears, at first glance, to undermine Uzbek identity, the fact that the DNA predates the ethnic category by millennia, is not a subtraction, it is an addition. It is evidence of something remarkable. This land has supported continuous, complex civilization for at least 4,000 years, through conquest after conquest, name change after name change, and the people absorbed all of it without being erased by any of it. They were not replaced. They code switched. They adapted. The language changed, the faith changed, the political category changed, the genome stayed. Consider the Sogdians, those ancient Iranian-speaking merchants and farmers who built the original Silk Road networks, whose art decorated Buddhist monasteries, and whose letters have been found as far away as China. History records that the Sogdians disappeared after the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries and the subsequent Turkic migrations. They were absorbed, the story goes, assimilated, gone. But the ancient DNA emerging from Uzbekistan suggests a different reading. They didn't disappear. They became Uzbeks. They became Tajiks. They became Karakalpaks. They became the people of the oasis cities who speak different languages today, but carry in their cells the same Bronze Age signal that the Sogdians carried when they were still called Sogdians. Uzbekistan is described in most history books as a land that was passed through by Alexander, by the Silk Road caravans, by the Mongol armies, by the Russian Empire, the Mongol armies, by the Russian Empire. The Kumar et al. 2021 finding of genetic continuity across the Bronze Age and the Iron Age says something that the history books have not yet fully absorbed. The people of this land were never passing through. They were the ones who stayed, while everyone else moved around them. The land changed names 6 times. The genome barely flinched. Uzbekistan is not a special case. It is an extreme version of a universal pattern. Ethnic identities are political categories. They are assigned by governments, by conquerors, by census administrators, by Soviet cartographers drawing lines on maps. Genomes are geological records. They operate on a different timescale entirely, thousands of years rather than hundreds, and they are not subject to reclassification. The DNA of the conquered persists long after the conqueror's label has replaced the previous one. These are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. Every people on Earth who has ever been replaced in the historical record may have simply been renamed. The bones stayed. The language changed. The record called it conquest. The genome calls it continuity. Somewhere in that gap between what the historical record says and what the cellular record shows, the real history of humanity is written, not in the names of khans or the borders of republics, but in something older and quieter, the way a river carries water from mountains that no longer have names. Not Mongol, not Persian, not Turkic. The Uzbek DNA mystery is not a mystery about who came to this land. It is a mystery about what it means to stay, and what is left of you, in the cells of those who come after, long after the name for what you were has been forgotten.